Literacy also played a key role in the politics of Judah. Judah was under siege. The northern Israelites had fled south en masse. Hezekiah had to hold the kingdom together. It seems his priests collected the slightly different northern and southern versions of Israelite history, and also wrote a new one to try to reconcile and unify the two traditions. These various texts were later to become part of what we know as the Old Testament. Hezekiah's situation would explain the importance of portraying David and Solomon as having once presided over an empire of all Israelites, based in Jerusalem. To promote unification, it seems Judah also now underwent a major religious purge. It appears worship began to be centralized in the capital. Half a millennium after the supposed time of Moses, this was the real beginning of monotheism, the belief in one God alone. The biblical account of Hezekiah's purge, more reliable because it was closer to the events, describes the destruction of idolatrous shrines.
And Hezekiah did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He removed the high places and brake the images.
Well, we are sitting within the fortress of Arad, first of all. It's not a big fortress. It's only about 50 on 50 meters, that's all. Surrounded by a big wall, and inside there is the most important find at this site, and one of the most important finds all over Judah in biblical times, the temple, which is right here behind us. This temple was probably constructed sometime in the beginning of the 8th century BC and lasted throughout the 8th century BC. It was then destroyed. And this reminds us of other sites in the Beersheba Valley, in Judah and in the north also, where you have cessation of cult places, countryside cult places, before the end of the Iron Age. And apparently there was some sort of centralization of cult as part of the growing power of the capital and the administration and the king and the centralized government in Jerusalem in the late 8th century.
The new centralized cult in Jerusalem was focused on a special local Israelite deity, probably as a way of rallying people behind the king and getting them to identify with the state. That deity was called Yahweh. We know him from the Bible as Jehovah, or more simply, God.
The name Yahweh is a name of an Israelite. God relating to Israel appears for the first time in the inscriptions of around 800 BC, found in the Sinai desert. And one of the inscriptions is a dedication to Yahweh and his Asherah. That means Yahweh, the God of Israel, in this inscription has a consort, a wife, called Asherah, just like the main god of the Canaanites. So you can see at 800 BC, the Israelite religion was not yet the fully developed monotheism as we have it in the biblical tradition.
Asherahs, female deities like these, emphasized fertility and maternity. Despite the developing cult of Yahweh, the population of Judah continued to flirt with polytheism long after Hezekiah's purge. After the siege of Lachish, Judah, now revolving largely around Jerusalem, sued for peace with Assyria. Over the next century, there was a period of calm. The stability led to growth and prosperity. By the late 7th century, Assyria had withdrawn from Judah. Hezekiah's great-grandson Josiah now appears to have begun developing ideas of expanding Judah. To rally his population behind him, he redoubled and intensified the centralization of worship around Yahweh.
In order to achieve the ideas of extension, territorial extension, and so on, Josiah needed centralization of power, strong administration, complete control of the state. One way to do that was to centralize cult, to do this reform of cult, which would lead back to the idea, to the pan-Israelite idea, that all Israelites must worship one God, that is the God of Israel, in one capital, that is Jerusalem, in one temple, that is the temple of the God of Israel, under one monarch, one king, the king of the lineage of David. That was the pan-Israelite idea which came into being in the 7th century BC.
At this time, Josiah's priests are said to have discovered a lost text which greatly emphasized the worship of Yahweh. They called it the Book of Law. It was almost certainly the Old Testament book that became known as Deuteronomy.
The book of Deuteronomy perpetrates one of the great reformations in history. It imposes a strict philosophical monotheism that banishes all other gods from traditional culture. This was part of a reformationist program in which King Josiah attempted to centralize not only power, but the ability to reach the realm of the divine into his own hands in Jerusalem, in the temple which sat in the backyard of the royal palace.
So somebody, a person or a group, sat down at that time and wrote the early core of the story. And the story serves Judah. It puts Judah in the center of the universe.
Deuteronomy was hugely important for Western civilization because for the first time, the individual was singled out from the crowd as the focus of moral responsibility and duties. Baruch Halpern believes this was actually connected to the earlier Assyrian attacks on Judah.
Many elements of the reform actually precede the reform. They're the result of the exile of the rural population of Judah in 701 BC by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The extended family essentially disappears from the landscape of Judah in the 7th century after 701 BC. We no longer have compounds housing extended families. We have individual houses. We no longer have collective tombs containing hundreds of people being buried together. We no longer have large cooking pots. We no longer have large ovens. All these things shrink down in size, as they do in other cultures when the extended family disappears and the nuclear family becomes the center of organization and identity. Effectively, what you see in the 7th century BC is the development of individuality.
These social changes were reflected in radical new laws in Deuteronomy. An ideological change of great enduring consequence.
There's something else about Deuteronomy which is remarkable, and this is what we can call today the ideas of civil rights, of rights of the individual, of the person. I mean, Deuteronomy is full of ideas how to protect women, children, slaves, people who lose their land, the simple people. It was probably one of the ways to attempt to mobilize the people of Judah behind the ideas of the new reforms, because they give them, the rights, if you wish, for the first time.
This pottery fragment from Josiah's time records a petition from an unknown agricultural laborer against his local commander.
What it testifies to is a new consciousness at the end of the 7th century, in the time of King Josiah, even among simple agricultural workers, that the power of the governor was subject to some greater laws, some greater morality. And it's here on this broken piece of pottery, as archaeological evidence from the time of Josiah, that what we now still believe as biblical tradition and biblical morality was born among the people in the fields of ancient Judah at the end of the 7th century BC.
What you have here is a case of the rejection of tradition. It's not the invention of tradition, it is the rejection of tradition. And that is the mindset, the self-conscious mindset on which science and monotheism and Western civilization have been founded.
Despite Josiah's confidence, his ambitions were soon thwarted. In 609 BC, here at Megiddo, Josiah was killed by Egyptians in uncertain circumstances. He was still a young man, his dream of a great new Israelite empire smashed. It seemed a terminal disaster for the Israelites, and this catastrophe has been immortalized in the biblical name for Megiddo, Armageddon. But Armageddon was not the end. The Israelites' greatest achievement was yet to come. The death of Josiah in 609 BC at the hands of the Egyptians seemed the end of all Judah's hopes.
And now everything is ruined. The Egyptians have power over the country. In the east, Babylon becomes a great power, and they have power over the country. Things continue to go worse to worse. And first there are 3 different sons and 1 grandson of Josiah who get to be the king. And finally, the last one of them is King Zedekiah. The Babylonians come under the great emperor Nebuchadnezzar. They surround Jerusalem. They defeat it. They march out all of Zedekiah's sons, and they execute them one by one in front of him, and then they put out his eyes, and they put him in chains, and they take him back to Babylon.
And Nebuchadnezzar carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives.
With the elite of Judah removed to Babylon and Jerusalem devastated, the kingdom was destroyed, and the remnants of the population left scattered and leaderless. But the Judahites taken to Babylon managed to preserve the memory of their religion and history. Jerusalem, or Zion, remained central to their thoughts.
It was a complete catastrophe. It could have been the end. So it's really interesting that at that time, the only hope, the only way to keep the identity and the tradition was around, the old stories.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion.
But in fact, the Judahites' exile didn't last long. Within 60 years, the first of them began returning to Jerusalem.
The Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, and under the Persians, the Jews were allowed to return, rebuild their temple, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild their country, under the Persians.
We are now in post-exilic times, in the 5th century BC or immediately thereafter. There is no king, there is no dynasty. Judah is not independent. We are speaking about the community of Yehud under the Persian Empire. The needs are very different. The situation is completely different than before.
The Judahites, or Jews as they now became known, were led by priests, and one of them played an absolutely critical role in the history of the Bible. This priest gathered together the various Jewish texts which were still remembered and put them into an official compilation known as the Torah. Richard Friedman believes this priest was called Ezra.
He's a priest, he's a scribe, he has access to the texts, and he's someone who has power because he's someone who's strong enough to come to the Jews and say, okay, this is the Bible from now on. This is Torah. and he stands the people up, and they hold a tremendous ceremony, and he has the priests stand up and read the text of the Torah. And that Torah that he created, the 5 books of Moses, is the Torah that everybody has read for 2,500 years since that time.
The year was 458 BC. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and in many ways its core, was later supplemented by further texts. These collective works have come down to us as the Old Testament.